The land had grown quiet in a way that only the desert could make quiet, where even the wind seemed too tired to carry sound, and Jacob Harlow sat on the edge of his broken porch staring out over the brittle stretch of his ranch, a place that had once carried the smell of fresh hay, the sound of hammer on anvil, and the proud chorus of horses snorting in the early morning, but now it was nothing more than dry boards, sagging fence posts, and the hollow echo of what had been, for he was a cowboy who had lived too many years by luck and grit, and lately both had abandoned him. He was a man of lean build, with sun-baked skin that showed every hour of every mile ridden under the merciless western sky, and though his hands had once been strong enough to rope a wild mustang or break a bronc that would send another man flying, those hands now trembled slightly when they held a cup of black coffee too long because hunger and weariness had become familiar companions. And the only living thing left that still carried pride upon this patch of dust was his last horse, a chestnut stallion named Red Fire, who had been with him through trails, cattle drives, winter snows, and blistering desert crossings. Jacob had watched one herd after another disappear. Some sold cheap to cover gambling debts he regretted, others stolen by rustlers in the night, others simply perishing during the endless droughts that left water holes cracked and barren, and as his fortunes thinned, so too did the laughter in his voice, until the silence between him and the wind grew heavier than any words he could have spoken. Red Fire was all he had left, the last piece of his cowboy pride, and yet even that pride felt hollow when he looked in the mirror and saw a man too broke to buy grain, too thin to last another winter, too tired to pretend that hope might ride over the horizon. And so when the Apache elder appeared at the edge of his land that late afternoon, Jacob thought at first he was dreaming, because Dakota, though Jacob didn't know his name yet, looked like a shadow out of the past, a man wrapped in a blanket worn soft by years, his hair silver and long, his face lined by the kind of wisdom you only earn when you have seen both war and peace, both bloodshed and mercy, and he came riding a tired bay pony that looked older than the dust itself, its step slow, its breath heavy, yet its eyes still alive with endurance. And Jacob rose slowly from the porch as if drawn by a memory rather than sight, his hand resting unconsciously on the rail while Red Fire lifted his proud head from the corral and snorted at the approaching stranger. The two men regarded each other without words at first, for in the West silence was often more honest than speech, and Jacob felt the weight of the elder's gaze, a gaze not of pity but of deep recognition, as if he saw more than just a broke cowboy standing before him, as if he saw a story written in sweat and loss. A man who had given more than life had returned. Finally Dakota dismounted with the slowness of age, straightened his back, and looked at Red Fire with a softness that carried reverence, and Jacob noticed how the elder's eyes lingered on the stallion's broad chest, his arched neck, the way the sun caught the copper glint in his mane, and then the elder spoke in a low voice, words wrapped in an accent of the land itself. "This horse, his blood remembers my people." And Jacob, puzzled yet strangely stirred, asked him what he meant, and Dakota told him a tale of long ago, when a horse like Red Fire had been taken from the Apache by white traders, a horse of great spirit that carried warriors into battles and dances, a horse whose descendants had vanished into the hands of ranchers and settlers, but whose memory lived still among his people as a symbol of strength. Jacob listened, torn between disbelief and the odd sense that maybe fate had tied his last possession to something larger than his own worn-out luck, and when Dakota finally said, "Would take this horse home, if you will let me," Jacob felt a sting in his chest like the last thread of pride being pulled away, for Red Fire was his last friend, the only thing he still called his own, and yet he saw in Dakota's eyes not greed but honor, a respect too rare in a world that had taken so much from him, and Jacob, after a long silence, asked, "What can you pay?" His voice hushed, almost ashamed to speak of money when both men knew that some things were worth more than silver or gold. Dakota reached into his blanket and pulled out a small pouch, from which he drew a single silver dollar, tarnished with years but gleaming still with the weight of hands that had held it before, and he held it out with dignity, saying, "This is what I offer. Not because the horse is worth so little, but because it is what is true. I give you what I have, and you give me what should return." And Jacob stared at the coin, feeling both the sting of humiliation and the strange comfort of fairness, and after a moment he took it, closing his rough fingers around the cool weight of that dollar, whispering more to himself than to Dakota, "A deal's a deal," and with that Red Fire belonged to another. The elder placed a hand on the stallion's neck, murmuring words in Apache that Jacob did not understand but felt deep in his bones, and the horse, instead of shying from the stranger, bowed his proud head as though recognizing an old master, and Jacob turned away, unable to watch as the elder led Redfire out of the corral, his throat thick with grief and resignation, because in that single exchange he had let go of the last piece of his life as it had once been. That night, Jacob sat on the porch with the silver dollar in his hand, staring at the pale face of the moon as coyotes cried in the far hills, and he thought of his father who had once told him that a man is measured not by the herd he owns but by the honor he carries when the herd is gone, and Jacob wondered if perhaps there was honor in what he had done, though the emptiness around him made it hard to believe. Sleep finally took him, heavy and dreamless, until just before dawn when a sound like distant thunder rolled across the plains, and at first he thought it was storm clouds breaking after so many months of drought, but when he stepped out onto the porch barefoot and blinking into the dim light, he saw not clouds but dust rising from the earth, and within that dust the shapes of riders, many riders, moving in unison, their horses thundering in a rhythm that shook the very ground beneath him, and as the light grew he counted them, one after another, until he realized there were near 100, young and old, Apache warriors painted in colors of the dawn, feathers and beads catching the first gold of the sun, their faces solemn, their movements precise, their presence overwhelming in its grandeur. At the front rode Dakota on Redfire, the stallion transformed as though the spirit of his ancestors had awakened in his blood, mane flying, hooves striking sparks from the earth, and when they reached the clearing before Jacob's broken ranch, the riders circled in perfect formation, the sound of hooves echoing like drums of the earth itself, and Jacob stood frozen as Dakota raised a hand and brought them to silence. The elder spoke then, his voice strong despite his years, carrying across the morning air. This man, Jacob Harlow, gave not for greed, but for trust, not for gold, but for honor. He returned to us what was ours, though it was all he had left. We do not forget such a man, and as he spoke, the 100 riders lifted their spears and rifles skyward, letting out a cry that rang like an eagle's call across the valley, a sound of both mourning and exaltation, and Jacob, overwhelmed, felt tears sting his eyes for the first time in many years, because in that moment he understood that he had not lost everything. He had given away despair and received a place in something greater than himself, his name bound now to a story that would ride in the hearts of a people who had chosen to honor him, and the empty ranch around him no longer felt like a graveyard of failure but like the starting place of a legend, where a poor cowboy's last horse had bought him immortality at the break of dawn.